I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of his cross.
This evening we're in Daniel chapter 7. We're down to verse 15, but I'm going to quickly read through the vision that we read last week so that we remember what it is, and then we'll get into the interpretation of it. Starting then at verse 1 of Daniel 7. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head while on his bed. Then he wrote down the dream, telling the main facts. Daniel spoke, saying, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. And four great beasts came up from the sea, each differing from one another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. And a man's heart was given to it. And suddenly another beast, a second, like a bear. It was raised up on one side and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And they said thus to it, Arise, devour much flesh. After this I looked, and there was another like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the other beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. And there in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words. I watched till thrones were put in place, and the Ancient of Days was seated. His garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was a fiery flame, its wheels a burning fire. A fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. 1,000,000 ministers ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were open. I watched then, because of the sound of the pompous words which the horn was speaking, I watched till the beast was slain, and its body destroyed and given to the burning flame. As for the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. I was watching in the night vision, and behold, one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom. Then all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which will not be destroyed. That's what we discussed last week. We talked about these 4 beasts, and how these 4 beasts, even though at that time we didn't know what they represented, reminded us of some symbolism that we get in the book of Revelation. It's not that these beasts were the beasts of Revelation. Let's not come along and make that mistake, and it's the same mistake that a lot of people do. We just come along and say, this is what Daniel said, this is what John said in Revelation, they're the same thing, and they represent the same thing. No, they don't. But the imagery used will help us. And that's why when you read the book of Revelation, if you study Daniel, if you study Ezekiel, you can understand the book of Revelation a little better because it uses a lot of the same imagery. And that's how the people of the New Testament would have understood it. We come along and say, how did the 7 churches of Asia understand the book of Revelation when we, 2,000 years later, have so much difficulty understanding it? And it's because they studied the Old Testament, whereas a lot of Christians today, I'm afraid, don't. They sort of skip it, and they say, well, really, it's not our law today, so why study it? We'll study the messianic portions of it, but really the rest of it we're just going to leave behind. I've had a couple preachers wonder why our podcasts are studying Deuteronomy, or at least the parts of Deuteronomy that aren't explicitly talking about Jesus, or Jesus didn't use in the New Testament explicitly. And I was writing today from Deuteronomy, I think it was 25. I was writing this afternoon. And it has there about the ox, don't muzzle the ox that treads through the grain. And that's in a section of passages that really doesn't talk about much that we would find important. But in that chapter, there's that verse, and Paul quotes it in 1 Corinthians 9. Never studied it, you don't know what it's talking about. Then, right after it, talks about levirate marriage. And you might think, well, what does that have to do with anything? The entire book of Ruth is based on it. Not understanding Deuteronomy makes it harder to understand other books, and we study the book of Ruth. A lot of all the books we study in the Old Testament, the book of Ruth, because it's so short, is often studied. And you don't get the foundational stuff if you don't read what we might call the boring stuff. First 5 books of the Bible, after you get past Genesis, once you get past the Exodus itself, a lot of people don't like reading Exodus 21 through the end. A lot of people don't like reading Leviticus, all the 27 chapters of that, or all, I think it's 36 chapters of Numbers. People don't like reading those because they contain a lot of names, a lot of laws. Yet they can lay a foundation. Well, the book of Daniel can lay a foundation for Revelation because it has a lot of the same imagery, and it's the same style of writing. These are visions that are being seen, and even Daniel didn't know what this meant. That's what we're going to be talking about tonight. So we're going to read 15 to 27. We'll start with Naomi. We'll do 3 verses each. We'll go around until we're through verse 27. Yes, I know there are 28 verses, but we'll leave 28 till the end.
As for me, Daniel, my spirit within me was anxious, and visions in my head alarmed me. I approached one of those who stood there and asked him the truth concerning all this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of the things. These 4 great beasts are 4 kings who shall arise out of the earth.
But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. Then I wish to know the truth about the 4th beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its nail of bronze, which devoured, broke in pieces, and trampled and rescued with its feet. And the 10 horns that were on its head, the other horn which came up, before which 3 fell, namely, that horn which had eyes and a mouth which spoke pompous words, whose appearance was greater than his fellows.
I was watching, and the same horn was making war against the saints and prevailing against them, until the Ancient of Days came, and a judgment was made in favor of the saints of the Most High. And the time came for the saints to possess the kingdom. Thus he said, the 4th beast shall be the 4th kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all other kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, trample it, and break it in pieces.
10 horns are 10 kings who shall arise from this kingdom, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the first ones, and shall subdue 3 kings. He shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time and times and half a time. But the court shall be seated, and they shall take away his dominion to consume and destroy it forever.
And the kingdom of the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. His kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him.
So, what do the beasts represent in general? We'll get into specifics in a little bit. What do the four beasts represent?
Kings.
They represent four kings. We do not have to wonder about that. But what these four kings will not do is they will not stop the saints of God from obtaining the everlasting kingdom. And that's important for us to realize, is that these four kings are going to be powerful. They are going to be powerful, but they are not invincible. Now remember, what were the days, in what period of time did Daniel see this vision? When was it seen?
First year of Belshazzar.
Okay, and he's king of what? Babylon. And so, we'll get into that maybe a little bit, but keeping that in context as to when these four kingdoms were, these four kings that we're going to talk about, remembering when Daniel saw this vision can be important. Now, which beast did Daniel want to know more about, and why? The fourth one, but why?
It was so different from all the others.
It's different than all the others, and that's usually something we like to do. We can spot, okay, these four beasts, they were different than each other, but this fourth one was very different. The fourth one was made of iron, and it's let me see, like as far as its dreadful, terrible, exceedingly strong, had iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, trampling residue with its feet. Different than all the other beasts, it had 10 horns. And so, yeah, human nature. Want to know what's different? What's special about that one? If these beasts represent four kings, what does that fourth beast represent? Now, what are the 10 horns? What are the 10 horns?
Other kings.
They were 10 kings of this fourth kingdom. So in other words, so that tells us when it comes to the four kings, we're talking about kingdoms here. We're not specifically talking about four different kings like Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar and Cyrus, like as far as, so the beasts represent kingdoms. But this fourth kingdom had 10 horns that represented 10 kings of this fourth kingdom. Now, in Bible imagery, what does the number 10 usually represent? Completion, perfection. So, whether or not we're talking about 10 specific kings, or just that this kingdom would have rulers that, like as far as a complete set of rulers, we do need to temper our speculation when it comes to that. A lot of times people like to count kings in certain kingdoms. And they'll come along and say, okay, this was the first king, second king, third king. And they do that in Revelation 2, like 11 Revelation as well, to try to come up with who's the beast of Revelation. And they try to make these speculative proclamations because we fail to realize, again, we're talking about things representing something else. The beast represents the kingdom. The horns represent the kings, but it's not necessarily talking about 10 specific ones. Now, of course, this beast had 10 horns, but it also had that little horn. What did that little horn represent? Verse 20. and 21.
That is what he did.
Yes. Yeah. What did he do?
Made war against the saints.
All right. So he made war against the saints, and if we remember, he also subdued 3 kings. Like as far as I think it might be a little later. Yeah, it's verse 24 that tells us that. The 10 horns are 10 kings who shall rise from this kingdom, and another shall rise after them. He shall be different from the first ones, and shall subdue 3 kings. And so there was going to be another king. And he's going to be 2 things. He was going to subdue those first kings. He was going to be greater than those first kings. He was going to be different than those first kings. In that, I believe what makes him different is how he treats the saints of God. It's not that these other kings just treated the saints of God spectacularly and everything was great and grand. But this king especially was going to speak against God. He was going to try to change times and laws. He was going to be a powerful king. Now, even though he was a powerful king, in verse 25 we find that he is going to be holding power only for time and times and half the time. The saints would be given into his hand, but not forever, because he wasn't going to have power forever. And so even he was going to not have power forever. Who was going to judge him? Who was going to judge him?
The court says.
All right, the court shall be seated, and they shall take away his dominion. Who do you suppose that court's going to consist of? May not say. We need an inference here.
Well, it doesn't say there, but the Ancient of Days had been mentioned
Yes.
previously as being a part of the vision.
Yes. The Ancient of Days was back there, and we talked about that being God. God was going to judge and take away this king's power. In other words, the kingdom that we're going to read of in just a second was going to stand. It was not going to be defeated. And the kingdom would be given over to the saints of God, whose kingdom and authority is everlasting and over all. And there's a lot of speculation about this, and this is where you get a lot of premillennialism out of this. If you hold the idea that Jesus Christ is coming back to set up his kingdom and going to reign 1,000 years on this earth, and the saints are going to reign with him. Daniel 7 is one of your favorite passages. And you come along and say that this hasn't been fulfilled. And then you go along and combine it maybe with the book of Revelation, which has a lot of similar language about the saints overcoming the beast and the Roman Empire. And you go to Revelation 20 and talk about 1,000 years. And you can combine a whole bunch of stuff, and you can come away thinking, well, that makes a lot of sense. And just reading it on its face, I'm not going to say that it's absolutely outlandish to come away with that if you don't read it carefully. I can see how people come along and they say, well, the saints are going to be given the kingdom, and it's going to last forever. But remember, the book of Daniel has been consistently being told the kingdom was coming. If you remember back to the statue of Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 2, when was the kingdom going to come? Let's go back to Daniel 2. Daniel chapter 2. And I think we're going to be down to verse 36. I'll read this quickly. This is the dream. Now we will tell you the interpretation of it before the king. You, O king, are a king of kings, for the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field and the birds of the heaven, he shall be given them into your hand. and has made you a ruler over them. You are the head of gold. But after this, another kingdom inferior to yours, and another kingdom, a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And a fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything. And like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all others. Whereas you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, yet strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay. And as the toes of feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. And you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay. They will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Inasmuch as you saw that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king that it will come to pass after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure. Sounds awfully like Daniel chapter 7. Even the symbols here about iron sound an awful like Daniel chapter 7 and the fourth beast. It was the days of this fourth kingdom that this kingdom was going to come. And so since Daniel had been told consistently about the coming kingdom of God, let's not forget Daniel 2. And let's remember that this was given in the days of Belshazzar. Cyrus hadn't come yet. And so the kingdom was going to be given to the saints during the period of the fourth kingdom. The saints would be persecuted during this time. And that fits with Revelation as well, in the church becoming victorious over persecution. That's what the book of Revelation is about, overcoming persecution. And so when you see in Daniel 7 these beasts being talked about, and one beast coming over another, you don't need to speculate, okay, which one's which kingdom. We can fairly certainly probably identify the three beasts as Babylon, the Medes and the Persians, and the Greeks, especially when you get down into that third beast. I got to get here, find it exactly. Those great beasts which are four kings with tribes. I was wanting to see something. Maybe I saw something and maybe I misread it the first time. About the kingdom. I'm going to have to read it again. But we'll get into more stuff about these kings that we're going to come after in a minute. Maybe it was when I was reading through the original thing, talking about the third beast. There it is. After this, in verse 6, after this I looked, and there was another third beast like a leopard, and had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given over to it. If you know anything about the kingdom of Alexander the Great, you know it was split in 4 after he died. And different parts were ruled by different people. Well, the heads, if the 10 horns of the fourth beast representing kings, it's not hard to come along and say, well, they did too. But again, we're going to try not to speculate too much. We can come along and though and see that these are 4 kingdoms. And the most important thing we realize is that in the days of the fourth kingdom, the saints were going to receive a kingdom. And that kingdom was going to be an everlasting kingdom, and whose dominion was from everlasting. And we can know from Scripture what kingdom that was. Henry, you want to get Luke 2, 1 and 2. Bill, Matthew 16, verse 19. Tammy, Hebrews 1, verse 8. And Naomi, Colossians 1, 12 and 13. First of all, Luke chapter 2, verses 1 and 2.
And it came to pass in those days that the decree went out from Caesar Augustus, and our war should be registered. This census first took place while Quirinius was governing Syria.
What kingdom was present when Jesus was born? What empire? Pardon me?
Roman Empire.
The Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was exactly described as this fourth beast, because the Roman Empire was more vast than any of those other kingdoms. Babylon was the greatest kingdom, but it didn't rule the entire world. But it was still the greatest of the four, because the Roman Empire was weaker than Babylon, even though it had more territory. The Romans had more territory. The Medes and the Persians were weaker because they were Medes and Persians, not just one. Alexander the Great's, his kingdom was divided after his death, not the same as Nebuchadnezzar's. And then the Romans who came after it, their kingdom was very strong, but very weak at the same time. It is in the days of the Romans, the fourth kingdom, that Jesus was born. Matthew 16, verse 19.
And I'll give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven.
Jesus has just said, on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it, and I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom was coming when Christ spoke those words. Hebrews 1, verse 8.
But to the Son he says, Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of righteousness is the scepter of your kingdom.
Remember we read in the vision about the Son of Man coming in the clouds, receiving a kingdom, having everlasting dominion. Hebrews 1 is the coronation scene of Christ. Your throne, O God, is forever. A scepter of righteousness is in the scepter of your kingdom. God speaks through his Son today, whom he appointed heir of all things. Christ is the king, and the kingdom exists. Colossians 1, 12 and 13.
Giving thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. He has delivered us from the dominion of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son.
So, during the Roman Empire, Christ came. Christ predicted, prophesied he was setting up a kingdom. He died on the cross, was raised again, ascended to heaven, and became king, just like Daniel 7 said he would. And the kingdom was going to have citizens, those who would be transferred from the power of darkness into the kingdom of the Son of God's love, Son of his love. The kingdom exists today, just as Daniel 7 said. We're not looking for a kingdom to be given to us. We're not looking for whether or not the 10 horns represent 10 powers on earth today that are going to come along, and this horn's going to make one world order, and then Christ is going to come and set up a kingdom. That's not in Daniel chapter 7. What is in Daniel chapter 7, though, is 4 kingdoms. Daniel lived under the first. He lived under the second. He wouldn't live under the third, but it was in the days of the fourth kingdom that the kingdom came. Now, Daniel just because he got the interpretation here, didn't mean he was absolutely satisfied. Let's get Daniel 7. Henry, you want to get verse 28.
Okay.
Daniel 7, verse 28.
And this is end of the account. As for me, Daniel, I saw as greatly troubled, then my countenance changed, and kept the matter in my heart.
All right. This is the end of this vision. Daniel still had his thoughts greatly troubled. He didn't quite know what to make of this vision. He kept it in his heart, but he was told to write it down. That's why we have it. At the beginning of the chapter, it says, I wrote it down. I wrote down my thoughts, is what I said. But didn't mean that Daniel was sitting there just going, I have now all knowledge, and I'm just going to be content with that. He was greatly troubled. We're going to find in his visions, he is confused about some of these things. God is going to tell him it's not for you. It's still in the future for others. It's sort of like what Peter said. The prophets were wanting to know the truth about the Christ, the Messiah, and how one would be saved. Daniel would have been one of those prophets who'd been itching to know, how, God, are you going to do this? Well, we have the whole story. Christ came, he died, he set up a kingdom. We don't need to know everything there is to know about these four beasts, but we can know that this was fulfilled prophecy. This is fulfilled prophecy. We are not looking for another kingdom in this world that's going to precipitate the coming of Christ. Let's not take this and intertwine it with Revelation to the point that we think it is still in our future. You can tie it a little bit with Revelation when it comes to the church overcoming the beast of Revelation, which was the Roman Empire. We can meld that in, but that's as far as we can take it. It's not about us. It was about the coming of the Christ and his kingdom.
I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to